You can drink your morning coffee, feel completely sharp, feel like you are handling your day, and be quietly training your brain right now to need twice as much caffeine to reach the same baseline by this time next month. The coffee is not the problem, the timing is, the additions are, and one specific variable that nobody in mainstream nutrition media talks about is actively compressing the most important repair window your body runs all day without you feeling a single symptom until the cumulative damage is already years old. I call what I am going to give you today the 90-minute coffee reset. Three components, all specific, all mechanistically grounded. I will give you all three at the end. But first, you need to understand what is actually happening in your body every morning before that first cup. Because the mechanism is counterintuitive enough that even people who read nutrition research regularly have usually not connected these particular dots. The invisible villain in this story has two names. The first is cortisol, the second is adenosine. And every morning, for the majority of people over 55, these two systems are being handled in exactly the wrong order, not dangerously wrong, subtly wrong in a way that costs you energy, metabolic flexibility, sleep quality, and over time, tissue repair capacity, while feeling completely normal. That is the part that makes it worth talking about for the next several minutes. Here is the foundational mechanism, and I want you to hold this image because everything else I say today builds on it. Your brain produces a chemical called adenosine continuously throughout your waking hours. Think of adenosine as a sleep pressure molecule, a slow accumulating sand filling an hourglass. The longer you are awake, the more adenosine builds in your cerebrospinal fluid and brain tissue. When enough accumulates, you feel drowsy, unfocused, ready to stop. Sleep clears the hourglass. A full night of sleep essentially resets adenosine to its daily low point. So when you wake up after 7 to 8 hours of actual sleep, you are at peak neurological clarity from a pure chemistry standpoint. Your adenosine hourglass is nearly empty. Now here is the part most people have never heard explained correctly. Caffeine does not destroy adenosine. It does not metabolize it or neutralize it. Caffeine is a molecular impersonator. It fits into the precise receptor slots in your brain where adenosine normally docks. When caffeine occupies those receptors, adenosine cannot deliver its drowsiness signal. You feel alert, but the adenosine itself is still accumulating behind the scenes, waiting. When caffeine eventually clears those receptors, which takes 5 to 6 hours in a younger adult with healthy liver enzyme function, and potentially 8 to 12 hours in a significant percentage of people over 55, adenosine floods in all at once. That surge is what creates the crash. Not low blood sugar, not dehydration, adenosine revenge, hitting all at once because it was chemically blocked from arriving gradually. Understanding this changes everything about when and how coffee works for your body. And it introduces the first stage of what happens every morning when most people reach for the pot before they have done anything else. Call this first stage the cortisol collision. In the first 30 to 45 minutes after waking, your body executes one of the most well-documented daily hormonal events in all of chronobiology, the cortisol awakening response. Cortisol is commonly described as the stress hormone, which is technically accurate but misleading in context. In its morning form, cortisol is your primary alertness and mobilization signal. It tells every system in your body, we are awake, we are upright, fuel is needed, brain is online, get to work. Under normal conditions in a healthy adult, cortisol rises sharply in the first 15 to 30 minutes after waking, peaks between 30 and 45 minutes, and then begins a controlled descent over the following 2 hours, before tapering into the afternoon and evening. This cortisol arc is not a side event in your biology. It is the master signal that coordinates morning immune function, metabolic readiness, neurological priming, and cardiovascular activation. When it runs cleanly and completely, you feel genuinely awake and energized without pharmacological assistance. When it is disrupted, blunted, or artificially overridden, the downstream consequences touch nearly every system I am going to describe today. Here is where the collision happens. Caffeine also elevates cortisol, not just in stressed or anxious people. in everyone, including habituated daily coffee drinkers who have been drinking coffee their entire adult lives. A study published in Psychosomatic Medicine by Lo Vallo and colleagues found that even in people who drink coffee every single day, caffeine administration produces a cortisol increase of approximately 30%, in occasional drinkers or in people under elevated metabolic stress, which includes a large proportion of adults over 55 managing chronic conditions, disrupted sleep, or significant life stressors. The cortisol elevation from caffeine can reach 35 to 50% above pre-caffeine baseline. So when you drink coffee in the first 30 minutes after waking, you are stacking a 30 to 50% pharmaceutical cortisol stimulus directly on top of a cortisol awakening response that is already at its daily peak. Your cortisol system is already running at full output. The caffeine does not push you higher in any meaningful way. The tank is full, the gas overflows, but your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the system that governs cortisol production, registers the overflow. It registers it every morning. And over weeks and months and years, it adapts by producing a flatter, less ambitious natural cortisol arc because it has learned to expect the pharmaceutical supplement to close the gap. Think of it this way. Imagine your morning alertness is a lever that goes from 1 to 10. Your natural cortisol awakening response, when it runs cleanly, can push that lever from 1 to 7 or 8 on its own. Caffeine at the right time, when adenosine starts to rebuild, when the natural cortisol arc has resolved, can push that lever from 7 to 9 or 10. That is a genuine enhancement. Now imagine instead that you hit caffeine the moment you wake up, while the natural lever is already rising. You get from 1 to 9 again, but you did not let the natural mechanism do its work. You trained the system to rely on external input for the initial rise. Over time, the natural mechanism stops trying as hard. By the time you are 60, you feel completely non-functional until the first cup hits, not because you are addicted in a dramatic sense, but because you methodically trained your HPA axis to produce a weaker, independent morning response. Dr. Andrew Huberman at Stanford has described this mechanism in accessible terms, and the underlying HPA axis adaptation literature has been consistent on this point for decades. What makes it specifically relevant after 55 is that the cortisol awakening response is already naturally blunted by the hormonal shifts of aging. In women post-menopause, declining estrogen attenuates the amplitude of the cortisol arc. In men, declining testosterone, which accelerates from roughly age 50 onward, has the same dampening effect. You are starting with a flatter curve. Every morning, caffeine collision flattens it further. The math compounds unfavorably. The simple correction, and it genuinely is simple even if it does not feel that way at 6:30 in the morning, is to wait 90 minutes after waking before the first coffee. Let the cortisol awakening response complete its natural arc. Then introduce caffeine when adenosine is beginning to rebuild from its morning low, which is precisely when caffeine's receptor blocking function provides real, sustained alertness rather than a pharmacological overlay on a system already maxed out. Now call this second stage the clearing window. Those 90 minutes before the first coffee are not dead time. They are arguably the highest value biological maintenance window of your entire day. Here is what is actually running during that window, and why protecting it matters. During the first 60 to 90 minutes after waking, your lymphatic system and glymphatic system, the brain's dedicated waste clearance network, are completing the overnight cleanse that began during deep sleep. The glymphatic system, discovered by Dr. Macon Nedergaard at the University of Rochester in 2012, is a fluid clearance mechanism that flushes metabolic waste products from the brain, including amyloid beta, the protein fragment whose abnormal accumulation is the defining pathological feature of Alzheimer's disease. Glymphatic clearance is most active during slow-wave sleep and in the immediate post-sleep transition period. Any behavior that artificially spikes cortisol in the first hour after waking, including early caffeine intake, constricts the fluid dynamics of this system by altering cerebrovascular tone. Not catastrophically, but measurably. Simultaneously, your body's insulin sensitivity is at its daily peak. Insulin sensitivity describes how efficiently your cells respond to insulin's signal to absorb glucose from the bloodstream. This sensitivity follows a clear circadian rhythm. It is highest in the morning after an overnight fast and declines progressively through the afternoon and evening, independent of what you eat. Research from the American Journal of Physiology has documented this pattern repeatedly. For anyone over 55 whose baseline insulin sensitivity has already declined by an estimated 25 to 40% compared to their mid-30s, due to the natural accumulation of visceral adipose tissue, reduced muscle mass, and hormonal shifts. This morning window is not just convenient, it is the metabolic sweet spot of the entire day. Black coffee, consumed without additions, does not meaningfully disrupt this window. Its caloric content is negligible, and while the caffeine cortisol mechanism I described creates a transient insulin signal, it is minor in the context of an otherwise clean, fasted state. For people running an intermittent fasting protocol, specifically a noon eating window, which I have used consistently for years because the circadian biology research supporting it is among the most compelling in the field. Morning coffee drunk black or with the specific additions I will describe does not close the metabolic window that fasting creates. What does disrupt it substantially is what most people pour into the cup without thinking about it. Call this third stage the blood sugar ambush. Take a standard American morning coffee. Add 2 tablespoons of flavored creamer. The popular refrigerated varieties, 8 to 12 grams of sugar per serving, depending on the brand. Some of the sweetened flavored creamers deliver 35 grams of sugar across 2 or 3 morning cups, the sugar equivalent of a full-size candy bar, consumed before 7 in the morning on a completely empty stomach, into a digestive system that has no food buffer to slow glucose absorption. The mechanism here is straightforward, but the consequence after 55 is specific enough to be worth walking through carefully. When you consume sugar on an empty stomach, glucose reaches your bloodstream faster and in a more concentrated spike than it would after a mixed meal. Your pancreas detects the rise and releases insulin to clear glucose out of the blood and into cells. Because insulin sensitivity is high in the morning, this clearing happens rapidly and efficiently. Blood glucose rises, insulin spikes, blood glucose clears, and often drops slightly below your fasting baseline, what is called a reactive hypoglycemic dip. That dip is the signal behind the 9 a.m. hunger, the 10 a.m. urge for a second cup with more creamer, the feeling that you need something sweet to get through the morning. The more metabolically damaging consequence is what insulin does while it is elevated. Insulin is the body's master storage hormone. Its presence in the bloodstream activates storage pathways and suppresses breakdown pathways. Specifically, insulin inhibits hormone-sensitive lipase, the enzyme responsible for liberating stored fatty acids from fat cells. When insulin is elevated, fat cells are locked. Lipolysis, fat oxidation, stops. You cannot burn stored body fat while insulin is meaningfully above baseline. So if you add sweetened creamer to your 6:30 coffee, then have a second cup at 8, then experience a glucose dip and eat a small something at 9:30, you have spent the entire biological morning with insulin chronically elevated, not dangerously elevated, but persistently elevated in a range that keeps fat cells locked. Meanwhile, you might believe you are running a fasting window because you haven't had a real meal. You haven't broken the fast semantically, but you have broken it metabolically, repeatedly, with each creamer addition, and your body has not been in fat-burning mode since 8 the previous evening. A 2017 meta-analysis published in Obesity Reviews found that reducing early morning insulin exposure, independent of total caloric intake, produced measurable reductions in visceral fat accumulation over 12 to 24-week periods. Visceral fat is the fat packed around your internal organs, liver, kidneys, intestines, heart. It is not the fat you can pinch under your skin. You cannot see it in a mirror and cannot feel it pressing. But it is metabolically active in a way that subcutaneous fat is not. It releases pro-inflammatory cytokines, including interleukin-6 and TNF-alpha continuously. It disrupts insulin signaling in the liver directly. And in men and women over 55, its accumulation tracks closely with the hormonal changes that shift fat distribution toward the abdomen. Every unnecessary morning insulin spike from flavored creamer is a small daily deposit into the visceral fat account. My husband's cholesterol profile before his aneurysm, this was about 8 years ago now, was not simply elevated total cholesterol. It was a specific pattern: low HDL, high triglycerides, high concentration of small, dense LDL particles. That triad is not a dietary fat problem. It is the metabolic fingerprint of chronic carbohydrate-driven insulin elevation. His doctors put him on a statin and a blood pressure medication and explained his risk in terms of genetics and stress. Nobody asked what he put in his coffee at 6 in the morning. Nobody mentioned that his morning routine was generating an insulin spike before 7 a.m. every single day, before a second one from a mid-morning snack, before a third from a quick lunch eaten at his desk. We spent 2 years learning how these systems interact, working alongside his medical team, and the morning coffee formula was one of the first variables we changed. I want to be careful here. His doctors supervised everything, and results for anyone managing cardiovascular risk will vary. This is not a prescription, but the mechanism is real and the change costs nothing. We have been told for a long time that coffee is coffee, that what you add to it matters for weight management in a simple caloric sense, but not for cardiovascular risk, not for hormonal patterns, not for metabolic architecture. The mainstream nutritional guidance for decades has essentially been moderate coffee consumption is neutral to beneficial. End of message. The first half of that is genuinely true, and the supporting evidence is substantial. A large cohort study published in the European Heart Journal in 2022, analyzing data from more than 300,000 participants, found that habitual coffee consumption was associated with reduced risk of atrial fibrillation, an arrhythmia that becomes significantly more common after 50. Research from the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health associated 3 to 5 cups of coffee daily with statistically significant reductions in risk for type 2 diabetes, Parkinson's disease, and liver cirrhosis. These are not small effects in small samples. They are consistent findings across large, well-conducted studies. But here is what those same studies systematically fail to capture, and this is the incomplete information that mainstream health media repeats without correction. Those protective effects are attributable almost entirely to the polyphenols in coffee itself, specifically chlorogenic acids, diterpenes like caffeine, and other antioxidant compounds. These compounds are present in the coffee regardless of when you drink it or whether you drink it at 6:30 or at 9. The polyphenol benefit does not depend on the timing. The cortisol collision damage, the adenosine tolerance degradation, the insulin spike from additives, these are not measured in large observational coffee trials because they require granular behavioral and biochemical data that population studies cannot collect. The headline "Coffee is healthy" is technically well supported. The implication that your current morning coffee routine, timing, additions, quantity, is optimized for your specific biology at 55 plus is simply not what the data says. A study from Maastricht University in the Netherlands, published in 2021, specifically examined coffee timing relative to the cortisol awakening response in adults between 45 and 65. Participants who delayed their first coffee by 60 to 90 minutes after waking showed significantly better sustained afternoon alertness, lower mid-afternoon fatigue scores, and reduced total daily coffee consumption compared to participants who drank coffee within the first 30 minutes of waking. The mechanism the researchers identified was adenosine receptor tolerance. When caffeine is introduced after the natural cortisol peak, rather than on top of it, the adenosine receptor system does not compensate as aggressively, which means less tolerance buildup, which means less caffeine needed to achieve the same effect over time. That study should be printed on every coffee bag in every grocery store. It is not, because it does not sell more coffee, and it does not sell more anything. Call this fourth stage the formula shift. You have waited 90 minutes. You have protected the cortisol arc and the blood glucose window. Now you are making the cup. What goes in it matters more specifically after 55 than it does at any earlier age, and the reasons are biological rather than cosmetic. The first addition is Ceylon cinnamon, not cassia, which is the standard grocery store brown powder in most American spice aisles. The distinction is chemically important. Cassia cinnamon contains high concentrations of coumarin, a naturally occurring compound that can cause hepatotoxicity, liver cell damage at amounts not far above what a habitual cinnamon user might consume daily. Ceylon cinnamon, sometimes labeled as true cinnamon, contains only trace amounts of coumarin. The flavor is lighter and less harsh. A quarter teaspoon in your morning coffee is the relevant amount. The mechanism of cinnamon on blood glucose regulation involves compounds called type A polymeric polyphenols, which activate GLUT4 glucose transporters in muscle cell membranes through an insulin-independent signaling pathway. GLUT4 transporters are the molecular gates that allow glucose to enter muscle cells from the bloodstream. Normally, insulin must bind to its receptor to trigger GLUT4 activation. The polyphenols in cinnamon activate a different pathway, specifically PI3K independent AMPK activation, that achieves the same glucose-clearing result without requiring an insulin spike. A meta-analysis published in the Journal of Medicinal Food, covering 10 randomized controlled trials, found that cinnamon supplementation reduced fasting blood glucose by an average of 24 milligrams per deciliter across study populations. A reduction of that magnitude is the difference between a fasting glucose of 115, borderline pre-diabetic, and 91, which falls within the normal range. For people over 55, where insulin resistance is the rule rather than the exception, an insulin-independent glucose-clearing mechanism that costs a quarter teaspoon and 3 seconds is worth understanding. The second addition is hydrolyzed collagen peptides, 5 to 7 grams, fully dissolved in hot liquid, adding no detectable flavor. After 55, collagen synthesis declines at a rate of approximately 1 to 2% per year under baseline conditions. In women in the immediate postmenopausal period, estrogen's direct role in supporting collagen synthesis is removed, and some research suggests collagen loss can accelerate to 30% over the first 5 years after menopause before stabilizing at a lower rate. Collagen is not a skincare concern in the context I am describing. It is a structural tissue concern. Arterial walls are 70% collagen by dry weight. Joint cartilage is 60% collagen. Intervertebral discs are 90% collagen. The maintenance of these structures depends on a continuous supply of the specific amino acids, glycine, proline, hydroxyproline, that collagen is built from. Research from the Penn State University Collagen and Tendon Biomechanics Laboratory, published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition in 2017 by Shaw and Barr and colleagues, found that 5 grams of gelatin, structurally equivalent to hydrolyzed collagen, taken 60 minutes before mechanical loading, more than tripled markers of collagen synthesis compared to placebo. The morning window, when collagen synthesis processes are naturally elevated following overnight fasting and before the day's mechanical loading begins, is biologically appropriate for this addition. If you also take a small amount of vitamin C nearby, even a quarter cup of orange juice before the coffee window, the hydroxylation reactions that assemble collagen from its amino acid precursors are better supported since vitamin C is the essential cofactor for the enzymes that perform this assembly. The third addition is where most people look uncertain, but the mechanism is specific enough to justify including it. 1 teaspoon of MCT oil, medium-chain triglycerides, derived from coconut or palm kernel oil, widely available and nearly flavorless, blended or briskly stirred into the coffee. Medium-chain triglycerides behave differently from long-chain fatty acids at the digestive level. While long-chain fats require bile emulsification and lymphatic transport before reaching circulation, MCTs are absorbed directly from the small intestine into the portal vein, bypassing the lymphatic system entirely, and travel immediately to the liver. There, they are rapidly converted into ketone bodies, specifically beta-hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate, which cross the blood-brain barrier and serve as direct neuronal fuel. Ketones do not require insulin to enter cells. They do not generate an insulin spike on their own. They are an alternative fuel pathway that operates independently of glucose metabolism. After 55, and especially in people with any degree of insulin resistance, which again describes somewhere between 40 and 50% of American adults over 50 by standard metabolic criteria, the brain's utilization of glucose begins to decline in efficiency. This is measurable via PET imaging as reduced cerebral glucose uptake in prefrontal and temporal regions. It is not dementia, it is metabolic inflexibility, the brain's primary fuel delivery system becoming sluggish. Ketones bypass this sluggishness entirely. Research examining MCT supplementation in adults with mild cognitive impairment, including work from Dr. Mary Newport reviewing ketone metabolism in early Alzheimer's pathology, found that even modest daily MCT intake produced measurable improvements in working memory scores. 1 teaspoon in the morning coffee is not a clinical intervention, but it is a consistent daily supply of alternative neurological fuel at the moment when your brain is running at its lowest glucose availability of the day. 1 teaspoon of MCT oil adds approximately 45 calories, entirely from fat, generating minimal insulin response and not meaningfully disrupting a fasting metabolic state by any evidence-based criterion I have encountered. Here is the uncomfortable part. I had read about the cortisol awakening response before I changed my coffee timing. I had bookmarked the adenosine tolerance studies. I had told my husband about the Ceylon cinnamon meta-analysis over breakfast on at least 2 separate occasions, and then added my regular creamer afterward, because changing an automated morning habit requires more than knowing the mechanism. It requires structure you do not have to think about at 6:45 in the morning when the habit is already reaching for the coffee maker. My husband had spent roughly 2 years converting this research into something daily and usable. He called it the Noon Reset Protocol, a 30-day daily companion, 2 pages per day. One page covers the specific biology of what is happening in your body that particular day of the protocol. The other is a tracker where you record your own patterns and start seeing them connect. The morning coffee mechanics are built into the adaptation phase, the first of 4 phases, because he recognized that getting the morning right is the foundation everything else sits on. He also built in 25 breakfast meal ideas with exact protein counts, because the research on breaking a fast correctly is very specific about protein thresholds at the first meal, and because the first meal determines a significant part of your insulin and energy dynamics for the rest of the day. Everything I have described this morning connects directly to what that first meal does or does not accomplish. The protocol is available through the link in the description for less than a restaurant meal. I say that not as a pitch, but because I spent months knowing the information and doing nothing with it, and the guide was sitting in my husband's computer the entire time. Call this 5th stage the afternoon caffeine tax. Most people know in a general sense that coffee in the evening affects sleep. Most people have concluded that stopping coffee by 2 in the afternoon is a reasonable boundary. After 55, this is one of the most metabolically expensive miscalculations your biology absorbs every single day, and you do not feel it as a sleep problem, you feel it as aging. Caffeine's half-life in a healthy young adult with normal liver enzyme activity is approximately 5 to 6 hours. Half-life means the time required for your body to eliminate half the caffeine from your bloodstream. A 200 milligram coffee consumed at 2 in the afternoon leaves 100 milligrams active at 7 p.m., 50 milligrams at midnight, and 25 milligrams at approximately 5 the next morning. 50 milligrams of active caffeine at midnight is enough to measurably suppress slow-wave sleep, the deep sleep stage where the most consequential overnight repair processes run. The over 55 specific complication is the enzyme responsible for caffeine metabolism in the liver, CYP1A2. This enzyme's activity is not fixed, it declines with age. It is suppressed by several categories of medication that become increasingly common in the over 50 demographic: proton pump inhibitors for acid reflux, certain antihypertensives including some calcium channel blockers, fluconazole, and similar antifungals. Oral contraceptives, relevant for perimenopausal women. In individuals with reduced CYP1A2 activity, which you may have and simply not know about because nobody routinely tests this, caffeine's effective half-life extends to 8, 9, or 12 hours. A 2 p.m. coffee for someone with slow caffeine metabolism is biologically equivalent to a midnight coffee for someone with fast metabolism. The caffeine is still sitting in your adenosine receptor slots when your slow-wave sleep phases should be running. A study published in the Journal of Clinical Sleep Medicine in 2013 by Drake and colleagues gave research participants caffeine at 0, 3, or 6 hours before bedtime, and measured sleep architecture using polysomnography, full overnight recording of brainwave patterns and sleep stage distribution. Caffeine administered 6 hours before bedtime produced a measurable reduction of more than 1 hour in total sleep time compared to placebo. The critical finding: participants in this study did not subjectively feel that the caffeine was disturbing their sleep. They reported feeling that they had slept adequately. The objective recordings told a different story. Compressed slow-wave sleep, fragmented REM, reduced total restoration, that the participants themselves had no access to. This is the nature of the problem. The sleep damage from afternoon caffeine is largely imperceptible in real time. You fall asleep at your normal hour. You wake up at a reasonable time. You feel functional. But the architecture of the sleep you received was altered in ways that accumulate across weeks and months into the kind of chronic fatigue, metabolic slowing, and cognitive dulling that almost everyone over 55 eventually accepts as the normal cost of aging. It is not normal. It is a nightly billing cycle for a coffee habit that ended at 2 in the afternoon. Call this sixth stage the architecture consequence. Slow-wave sleep, the third stage of non-REM sleep, sometimes called deep sleep or delta sleep, is where your pituitary gland releases the single largest pulse of human growth hormone of the entire 24-hour period. Growth hormone after 55 is not a bodybuilding molecule. It is a maintenance signal. It governs muscle protein synthesis, collagen repair in connective tissue and arterial walls, bone mineral density maintenance, and the activation of fat oxidation pathways in the liver. The New England Journal of Medicine published seminal research in 1990 documenting that growth hormone levels decline by approximately 14% per decade after age 30. By 65, most adults carry resting growth hormone levels somewhere between 70 and 85% lower than their levels at 25. The overnight growth hormone pulse that occurs during slow-wave sleep is not replaceable by any dietary intervention I am aware of. Exercise stimulates a separate acute growth hormone pulse, and that is genuinely useful, but the slow-wave sleep pulse is the sustained overnight release that governs the actual tissue maintenance work. Afternoon caffeine, by suppressing slow-wave sleep architecture, directly reduces the magnitude of this overnight hormone release. The person on the receiving end of this reduction does not feel it as a growth hormone deficiency. They feel it as muscle that takes longer to recover after exercise, skin that seems to thin faster than it should, joints that ache in the morning more than they did at 45, energy that is inexplicably lower despite sleeping what feels like enough hours. The cascade runs deeper. Reduced overnight growth hormone release means slower muscle protein synthesis in the recovery window following physical activity. Slower muscle protein synthesis means that whatever training you are doing, walking, resistance work, swimming, produces less structural adaptation than it should. The muscles rebuild more slowly. Over months, lean muscle mass declines faster than it would with optimized sleep architecture. Declining lean muscle mass reduces resting metabolic rate because muscle tissue burns approximately 6 times more calories per pound per day than fat tissue does. Lower resting metabolic rate means fat accumulation even without changes in caloric intake. And visceral fat, as it accumulates, releases interleukin-6, which research has shown to directly suppress pituitary growth hormone release, creating a self-reinforcing cycle that afternoon caffeine set in motion. The connection from afternoon coffee to compromised body composition through sleep architecture and growth hormone is not obvious. Nobody draws that line in standard health content. But the mechanism is documented at each step, and the practical interruption point is available, simple, and costs nothing. Stop caffeine at noon. Call this 7th stage the quantity recalibration. Even with perfect timing, 90-minute delay, noon cutoff, quantity matters enough to address specifically. The research showing coffee's protective effects clusters almost entirely around 3 to 4 standard cups per day. 2 cups appears to capture most of the measurable benefit. Above 5 cups, the risk-benefit curve flattens or reverses, particularly for blood pressure control, anxiety regulation, and cortisol load. But here is the mismatch that most people are unaware of. A standard cup in published research is 8 ounces of brewed coffee at a typical coffee to water ratio, containing approximately 80 to 100 milligrams of caffeine. A 12-ounce medium drip coffee from most commercial chains contains 150 to 220 milligrams. A 20-ounce large contains 300 to 400 milligrams. A person who drinks 3 cups of coffee a day out of a 20-ounce travel mug, refilled twice, is consuming the caffeine equivalent of 6 to 8 research cups. They are well past the range where protective effects were measured. They are into the range where cortisol load, vascular reactivity, and bone calcium excretion become the dominant biological story. Calcium excretion is worth one specific mention. For every 100 milligrams of caffeine consumed, the kidneys excrete approximately 2 to 3 milligrams of calcium in the urine through a caffeine-mediated suppression of renal calcium reabsorption. At moderate intake, this is trivially compensated by dietary calcium. At high chronic intake, particularly in postmenopausal women where bone remodeling is already shifting toward net loss due to estrogen withdrawal, the cumulative calcium excretion of high-dose habitual coffee drinking represents a small but measurable contribution to bone density decline. Not the primary driver. A real secondary variable. The practical correction is simply to keep intake within the 2 to 3 actual 8-ounce cup range, which happens naturally when timing is restricted to the 90-minute post-waking to noon window. Now, the 90-minute coffee reset. 3 components, all specific, named because naming a protocol makes it executable rather than theoretical. The first component is called the delay. No coffee in the first 90 minutes after waking. 90 minutes is not arbitrary. The cortisol awakening response requires approximately 75 to 90 minutes to complete its natural arc from initial rise through peak to the beginning of descent. 45 minutes is not sufficient. At 45 minutes, you are drinking caffeine at the exact cortisol peak, which is the worst possible timing, not an improvement. If 90 minutes genuinely feels impossible in your current schedule, 60 minutes is meaningfully better than 30. But 90 is the target where the mechanism fully engages. During those 90 minutes, the protocol is water first, 12 to 16 ounces of room temperature water within 5 minutes of waking. You have been mildly dehydrated for 7 to 8 hours, and every neurological and hormonal process running the cortisol arc depends on adequate hydration to execute properly. Then light movement, 10 minutes of walking, gentle stretching, or mobility work, not because of calories. Because the cortisol awakening response requires physical movement signals to complete its full amplitude. A body that lies still in bed scrolling produces a blunted, incomplete cortisol arc even under ideal circumstances. Sunlight exposure to the eyes within that same window, even through a window if outdoor access is not practical, activates the circadian clock input from the suprachiasmatic nucleus that governs the entire downstream hormonal architecture of the day. The second component is called the formula. Your morning coffee contains black coffee base, 1/4 teaspoon Ceylon cinnamon, 5 to 7 grams hydrolyzed collagen peptides, 1 teaspoon MCT oil, no sugar, no flavored creamer, no artificial sweeteners. Research published in the journal Cell in 2022 by Suez and Weiss and colleagues at the Weizmann Institute of Science found that saccharin, sucralose, and aspartame alter gut microbiome composition in ways that impair glucose tolerance, the very metabolic function artificial sweeteners are typically used to protect. The irony is precise and well documented. If whole cream is genuinely necessary for palatability, 1 tablespoon of heavy cream contains less than half a gram of carbohydrates and produces minimal insulin stimulus. That is the least metabolically disruptive concession available. The third component is called the cutoff, last coffee at noon. This is the half-life arithmetic applied to a real schedule. If the final coffee is at noon and half-life is 5 to 6 hours, the caffeine load at bedtime is below 30 milligrams, an amount the research consistently shows does not meaningfully alter sleep architecture. If you have any reason to believe your caffeine metabolism is slower than average, you are on any of the medications I mentioned, or you have noticed that afternoon tea reliably affects your night, move the cutoff to 11 a.m. The afternoon energy dip that previously sent you to the coffee maker is not a caffeine deficiency. It is the natural circadian alertness trough that occurs 7 to 8 hours after waking, lasting typically 20 to 30 minutes and resolving without intervention once the morning cortisol and adenosine systems have been given room to run their correct architecture. The common mistake that invalidates the entire protocol is executing the formula correctly while ignoring the timing. Collagen in your coffee at 6 a.m. while cortisol is colliding with caffeine is better than creamer, but it is still a suboptimal biology scenario. The three components work together as a system. Timing is the foundation, formula is the optimization. Cutoff is the compounding protection that allows sleep architecture to deliver overnight what no morning routine can replace. What you are building over 3 to 4 weeks of consistent execution is not a coffee trick. You are restoring the natural amplitude of a hormonal system that habitual early morning high dose caffeine had been progressively flattening for years, sometimes for decades. The first few days of the delay protocol feel slow. That is the system recalibrating. The adenosine receptor density is readjusting. The HPA axis is remembering how to generate its own morning signal. That recalibration period is the mechanism working, not the mechanism failing. By week 3, most people describe something that takes them genuinely by surprise, a feeling of actual alertness before the first coffee that they had forgotten was possible. Not boundless energy, not a transformation, just the quiet, functional morning clarity that your biology was always capable of producing before a decade of pharmaceutical override convinced you it was gone. If you are starting the 90-minute coffee reset this week, comment the word 90 below so I can see who is actually doing this rather than just watching it. And if you have not subscribed yet, the next video goes into exactly what to eat at that first noon meal to keep every mechanism we discussed today running in the right direction.